morning, everyone. Welcome to all participants who are attending the Sojica conference via Zoom and those who are watching us live on Facebook. After a successful first day Sojica conference, we are ready for another day of intense discussions on Soji Asylum. As many of you may know, I'm Carmelo Danisi and I'm a member of the Sojica research team, and I'm honored to introduce the second keynote speaker of the Sojica conference, Vitit Muntarbhorn. Before introducing our guests, let me briefly remind that we will open the floor for questions from the audience just after the keynote speech. For technical reasons, we are not able to open the session up to oral questions. Sorry for that, but everyone is free to ask questions by using the chat, the Q&A function. So I will collect questions for our speaker with the support of our amazing facilitator, Nuno, the Sojica team leader. So thanks, Nuno, for facilitating this session and more generally for the years we have spent together at Sojica, now that the project is coming to an end. Now let's talk about our amazing guests. We are extremely happy to have with us Vitit Muntarbhorn. He is Emeritus Professor of Law at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Of course, you know, he is former independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity at the United Nations. And he also accepted to be a member of our Sojica Advisory Board, for which we will always be very grateful. Among many other achievements and appointments at the international level, I just want to remember to our audience that Vitit is a current member of the International Labour Organization Committee that monitors the implementation of labour rights internationally. And at the UN, he has covered a lot of positions, including the Special Rapporteur on the Sale of Children, Child Prostitution, and Child Pornography on Children. And of course, when I wrote and asked him about this introduction, I was really surprised that he described himself as a volunteer on human rights. So what an illuminating description, Vitit. And it was a pleasure to know that you started your first voluntary work in rural development. So by building a school library, and of course, by doing pro bono work for LGBTI people as well. So, and the unfinished work with Soji minorities is one of the issues addressed by his speech. So thank you, Vitit, and the virtual floor is all yours. Tell me when I share your presentation. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to join. It's a real pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to be on board Sojica. And I'm very delighted to speak to you from Bangkok. So to everyone, please relax on a slightly heavy topic, and very warm greetings from Bangkok. And I have a PowerPoint to show you, so you can liaise nicely, quietly, in a relaxed manner with the PowerPoint as I move along the various slides in terms of a chit-chat with you. And please think of it as a chat between friends and family. It's not a lecture or anything at all. But of course, some of the issues are very prominently international and local issues. And so I will now invite you to have a little look at the topic, please. Thank you very much. Yesterday, I was listening in and I was very impressed, very touched by the presentation on the European asylum policy and practice, and of course the challenges facing our friends and families. And so today, I'm trying to look at a slightly broader phenomenon in terms of what's happening globally, and in view of particularly COVID-19. And I know that the current independent expert will speak to you more on this tomorrow, but I would like to link this with my own humble interests and to complement what he will probably talk about tomorrow. So let me take you through this topic of protection against violence and discrimination in a world of gender diversity, and particularly the interface with COVID-19 and its consequences now. Next slide. First of all, let me invite you to look at the terminology, because I think we assume that everybody knows what we're talking about. But actually, it's not the case, because I met a member of a UN Human Rights Committee, I won't say which one, who looked at me and said, Vitit, what does the word intersex mean? So we shouldn't presume too much. And let me take you through some of the terminology that is very much with us. Sexual orientation. In normative thinking, sex is basically biological. So the sexual orientation is really to do with our leaning, our orientation towards other people, which can be, it can be homosexual, same sex, or it can be heterosexual. So when we talk about sexual orientation, actually we're talking about the whole of humanity. It's not just about gays and lesbians and bi and intersex and trans. It's about everyone. But we are very concerned, of course, with the impact of discrimination and violence against our friends who are from the LGBTI community. Secondly, gender. Gender is more of a social construct, and it gives us a lot of leeway in terms of how we look at ourselves, how we feel, and how we externalize what we are. And this is why gender identity is so important, because gender identity does not have to be the same as the biological sex. And that's very important, because what we self-identify as gender can be different from what is assigned biologically at birth. And this is very much also to do with our friends in the transgender community and more. The third expression is now becoming more widely used, and that's gender expression. And gender expression is really to do with how we express ourselves in terms of our chosen self-identified gender in a certain way, but the way that we want to externalize what we are. So we might dress in a certain way, different from what's assigned or different what's imputed. And this issue is very much to do with how people are impacted upon when certain laws and policies are used against them in regard to how they dress, how they act, how they externalize what they are. And you might have heard of another term that is very much colloquial, and that's cross-dressing. There are many countries also which have laws against cross-dressing, and we'll come to that in a moment, sadly. And the fourth term is sex characteristics, which is slightly more new, I think, to many people. And this is very much to do with the physical condition of those who are born with certain specific characteristics. And this is very much linked with the other term that we'll see later in terms of the intersex friends who might have certain specific traits in terms of genitalia. In colloquial terms, you might have both male and female physical characteristics within myself or yourself or whatever. And these are characteristics that we should respect, and they shouldn't be meddled with, they shouldn't be tampered with, there should be no surgery unless and until someone with those characteristics chooses voluntarily in terms of prior informed consent when the person is old enough to choose what the person wishes to be seen and wishes to be. And of course, these four terms are very much linked with lesbians, and I think you know what that means, gays, bisexual, who can be either, transgender people, and intersex that I just mentioned. And very importantly, within UN circles, and this is how I started a few years ago, I always emphasize that when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, we are talking about everyone. Every human has sexual orientation and gender identity. You can't be human otherwise. You're human because you have also SOGI. However, it is very sad that those with specific choices, specific preferences in terms of what they are, in terms of self-identification or self-determination, they are discriminated against and there is violence against them. And that is where we link up with the groups LGBTI, who appear more and more now in UN circles, fortunately. Next slide. And with COVID, everybody's been through COVID. I was stuck at home for 3 months and I started to develop a little stomach problem as well, sitting too much at home perhaps. So we are having to link today with a phenomenon that is with us and that will have consequences now and for the future. And what the current friend, Victor Madrigal-Bolos, has done is to produce a set of guidelines that I'm sure he'll talk about tomorrow, which will invite good responses from all stakeholders, particularly the states. Now, I will not go into these guidelines in detail, but I just want to list them quickly because I want to complement them with various key challenges around these guidelines, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But let me just take you through these guidelines, whose acronym is ASPIRE, A-S-P-I-R-E. And what's the messaging from the current independent expert? Next slide. ASPIRE means acknowledgement, support, protection, indirect discrimination avoidance, representation, and evidence gathering, which are elaborated upon as follows in the next slide. A, we're talking there in terms of acknowledging that LGBTI persons are everywhere and that they are hard hit by the pandemic. That is a very important message. S, we call for support for the work of LGBTI, civil society, and human rights defenders, and to learn from their significant achievements. P, the call to protect LGBTI persons from violence and discrimination in the pandemic, and to prosecute, take action against perpetrators. Next slide. I, we have to take into account indirect discrimination as well as direct, significant risk, which exacerbates stigmatization, marginalization against LGBTI. R means representation of LGBTI persons in the process of design, implementation, and evaluation of COVID-19 specific measures as key and to reflect their voices. And finally, E, the call to have evidence, evidence-based approach, evidence concerning the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTI must be gathered, and states must follow good practices. And I would just add, with good follow-up as well. Now, those are the 6 I'm sure he'll deal with tomorrow. And I want to add 6 challenges as follows now in red. Next slide. Every country today, we are witnessing, because of COVID, ascendancy of the executive branch with even more powers. It's your prime minister or it's your cabinet that orders instantly. And very few people are able to question what they do. And yet, gradually, this issue is coming up now because we want to know whether those powers are really necessary in the long run, maybe in the short term, but what about the medium term and long term? So beware of ascendancy of executive branch. Secondly, securitization of control under the heading of national security and public health. Several countries, like here, where I'm sitting, they use the curfew. We have lockdowns, we have quarantine, we have border closure, we have rejection of refugees in the name of security. And we want to know whether this is really balanced or not. And We have to have a way of checking. And yet the trend is securitization, and it's very worrying. And thirdly, the erosion of checks and balances. The various pillars of the community beyond the executive branch have become more compliant. The judiciary, parliament, in some countries a bit more vocal, but in many countries very quiet. And I know that nearby we had some court cases where the judiciary just said, oh, emergency power is being used. We can't touch what's being done under emergency powers. What about the people who are affected? Three very key issues of creeping jurisdiction of executive branch more than others. Next three. And in that perspective, ultimately, we have to deal with various additional constituents of the impact. One, health and medical. It's becoming even more difficult to access healthcare in many countries. And that's going to affect LGBTI people even more too, in terms of intersectionality of impact. Two, the social impact. We know about increasing destitution and deprivation. We know about increasing unemployment, and this is going to impact LGBTI people as well, and more. Intersectionality of social deprivation. Thirdly, protection issues. Vulnerable groups, including some LGBTI friends, are becoming more vulnerable. Rejected, poor, hate speech, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, all mixed up with intolerance and lack of respect. Intersectionality of violations and violence, very sadly, happening day by day. And it is this scenario that we have to address and be prepared for and give hope. We're looking at realities and we will take steps to give hope. We're not talking about despondency. And that's why we will move to some next slides in terms of what we can do. Now, in those perspectives of today's challenges, 6+6, so to speak, we have rather long-standing concerns which have been addressed from the very start of the UN mandate under the work of the UN independent expert on the question of protection against violence and discrimination based on SOGI. And let me take us through these and see where we are today and the way that they interlink also with COVID-19 ultimately. Number one, we have been concerned for many, many years about criminalization of consensual same-sex relations. And we're still stuck with nearly 70 countries. I think in the latest ILGA report, about 64 countries. But all is not lost. So we'll talk about progress in a moment also. Botswana, the highest court overturned the law, which was a law against consensual same-sex relations. But today we're also thinking broader in terms of criminalization. For example, I mentioned, cross-dressing, gender expression. I was counting about 20 countries that criminalize cross-dressing. And yesterday, our friend from ILGA was talking about all kinds of other laws that criminalize, that have impact on people, including on sex work, etc. And over here and elsewhere, national security law, public order law, both local and national, often used to criminalize. So you don't have to just look at a law that says anti this, anti that. There are many of these very general laws that impose sanctions in terms of alleged crimes. Secondly, weak anti-discrimination measures. And this may mean even if you have a good law, the implementation is weak, and this often happens in many countries. In some countries, there is no discrimination in the law, but the discrimination is in the practice. And in some countries, you have a law to protect, and yet in practice, there is discrimination. So we'll look at this in a moment in terms of the laxity of implementation, while we want more solid legal framework and backup. Thirdly, non-recognition of gender identity. And you can very much link this with all the discussions about the book written by a certain lady who earned billions and billions from her books today in terms of her approach towards trans people and the question of gender identity. I think you know what's up in terms of what's been in the news about certain views from a certain person, a writer, well-known writer, on the question of gender identity in the past weeks. Fourth one, pathologization of SGI. We were looked at as medical cases, as ill at a certain point in time. And the question is, how do we move towards depathologizing? And how do we enable the world to see that gender diversity is just normal? That's all, part of life, and something we should recognize and not discriminate against. Fifth, next one. Sociocultural and other exclusion. And this calls into play how socially, culturally, politically, economically, LGBTI people are accepted or not accepted, but very often they are excluded. And today, most of you have probably heard about Sustainable Development Goals, which has this caption of leave no one behind. But you go and ask the various countries whether they really mean this in practice, and you'll find a lot of difficulties there because they probably didn't think about, or they probably don't want to think about certain vulnerabilities, including those who are LGBTI. 6, lack of understanding and empathy, including non-tolerant education. And of course, the amount of phobias coming through lack of understanding now with social intercourse through social media as well. And how do we educate people to be more accepting, to be more respectful, not be so violent, not be so hateful, all these issues. And the test is really to how to nurture empathy and understanding within people through education and socialization. And we'll get to this in a moment in terms of some action. 7th, I added this because it's been creeping up on me a little bit as a concern, because I did a country study before finishing the mandate. I went to Argentina, and one of the major issues visiting was, what about gender neutral facilities, toilets? And why do we have to sort of divide everything into binary facilities? How to cater to non-discrimination, to non-binary in terms of facilitation is something that we should think about much more. And this is very much on the table, because, you know, many forms arrive on my table, on your table, where you have to tick whether you're male or female or not, and there's no third box, or some of us don't think it's necessary at all to tick. Sometimes I have to sort of hand the paper back and say, why do I have to tick this? You know, it's a private matter. And on this issue, I think we've had some help, particularly from Dr. Carter Plus 10, which is a set of principles a variety of friends in this field evolved, and just a couple of years ago there was a lot of discussion on this, and they concretized some advice on this, which I'll look at later in terms of preferred practices of gender neutral facilitation. And then last but not least, the question of marriage and civil union between same sex. And of course, many European countries have now come to this consensus on this, so to speak. And you have the European Court of Human Rights, which is helpful. But in many other countries, in Asia, there's only one country at the country level which has a law to legalize same-sex, and that's Taiwan. And I was in Taiwan last year. But you know, the irony when I was in Taiwan was also this. I asked them not about same-sex marriage, I asked them about trans people. I said, do you recognize legally gender identity of trans people? And the question was not quite. And we had to discuss about whether you need surgery or not. And I said, well, I don't think, the UN doesn't think you have to have surgery by, you know, sort of force, so to speak, forced surgery. If you want to have surgery, well, that's up to you. But gender identity should not be dependent upon surgery, especially if it's the forced kind that we've witnessed in many countries. So that was the conversation in a certain country that now recognizes same-sex marriage, which means this. We have to be very careful not to generalize. Situations differ. even in one country, situations differ in regard to LGBTI. And that calls upon us to probe with evidencing to see the differentiation so that we can advocate that the rights must be the same. And the advocacy against discrimination, advocacy against violence must be the same for all groups without discrimination. So let's move on to the next slide. Where do we go with those 8 concerns, which are covered by UN reports? Well, I certainly did in my first reports, and Victor has been through them as well, and he has his own emphasis now, which I welcome very much, which he'll talk about tomorrow. Number 1, we call for decriminalization, which means overcoming the bad laws, yes, but sometimes if you wait for Parliament or the executive branch, especially with the increasing power of the executive today, it's not going to work. So we've witnessed good courts helping. India, a couple of years ago, it was the Supreme Court that overturned the old criminal law, which was a colonial criminal law actually, which had criminalized same-sex relations. And more recently, Botswana did the same in Africa. So we welcome that very much. And my take on this is also to advocate, look, if you have a law that criminalizes, at least for the moment, don't apply it. If you have a bad law that conflicts with human rights, don't apply it. And of course, ultimately, we have to reform it, but at least use that suspension initially to stop the hate, to stop the discrimination and violence. Next slide. About 64, according to Gilga's most recent report, still criminalized, and some with death penalties, including executions, sadly, over the past year. And we have seen some backtracking. Some African countries have been introducing draconian laws and might be introducing or reintroducing draconian laws, such as Uganda, which at one stage was trying to introduce a law with a death penalty for same-sex relations, might be taking that up again, even though the first episode did not evolve into a law. But there's a second episode now that we have to deal with in terms of an attempt again to introduce a law with a death penalty for same-sex relations. Next one. Effective anti-discrimination measures. We noticed some countries which have been reforming their laws and policies to integrate SOGI, particularly SO, constitutionally or by law. I mean, Fiji, a little island in the Pacific, has a constitution that protects people against discrimination based on sexual orientation. And recently, Cuba also adopted a law which integrates protection against sexual orientation. And we need to spread this much more to GI, gender identity, as well as gender expression and sex characteristics. And in Europe, you have some good examples of countries which do protect. Malta is the key case. Malta covers particularly SOGI and sex characteristics. And increasingly, other countries are adopting a broader perspective of coverage in terms of protection against discrimination. I was in Argentina, which also covered these issues. And we need to call for good application of whatever policies and laws we have in practice, and to have mechanisms of redress and to receive complaints as well, which are often missing in many countries. And today, even more difficult in COVID times. Difficult to go to court at the moment in COVID times when you're trying to question a practice belonging to the executive branch, whose power is increasing precisely because of COVID times. And yet, we are not despondent. We will build alliances to promote progress, even amidst these times. Third one. Next one. We need laws and policies and practices that recognize gender identity. And some of you who are familiar with the European situation, you have a European Court of Human Rights judgment on this. So basically, European countries must recognize legal identity, legal gender identity, in terms of how people self-determine, self-identify. But while this means that you don't need to have surgery unless you want to, I think even with that European Court of Human Rights judgment, the question of whether you need counseling is still slightly unsettled. But in some countries, the position is clear. In Argentina, you do not need counseling to choose whom you are in terms of gender, nor do you need surgery unless you want it. Huh? And in my region, we have some positive developments in Pakistan, in Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Various countries now recognize this with the help of the judiciary sometimes. It was a court in Nepal, or some of the more enlightened administrators, such as in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, in terms of opening up to gender identity. But, you know, at the same time, in some of these countries, it's still illegal to have same-sex relations. So on the one hand, the rights, so to speak, pertaining to trans people been elevated, but not the same for gays or lesbians. So that's why we have to look at this variety of situations rather than generalize and tackle them well together, holistically. Thank you. Next one. Pathology, how not to medicalize the condition. We need to link up with the medical sector. And I was saying to our friends at Josica that it'd be nice if we get on board scientists and medical sector to talk about all these issues. And this has been very much related to the classification by the World Health Organization itself, because, you know, gays and trans people were at one point in time under classification of diseases. And gays were taken off the list in the early 1990s. No, until 1990, a UN organization still classified gays as mentally problematic. And imagine if the World Health Organization took gays off the list in 1990, how long did it take the medical profession in my country to take gays off their list at the local level? It wasn't instantaneous. It was several years later. And likewise, we welcome the fact that there has been reclassification, particularly of trans people. The description of transgender people used to be under classification of diseases, used to be dysphoria. Now I think they use the word incongruence, which I still don't like very much. But the classification of trans people has been shifted from disease, mental issues, to sexual health. And so it's a bit better, but it's still not totally complete. And I'm not sure whether they cover intersex people as well in terms of this reclassification. So this is a work in progress, and we need to build understanding with the medical sector well, so as not to pathologize LGBTI, because in my humble thinking and advocacy, we are just humans, that's all, who don't want to be discriminated against and violated. Next one. And the most recent report by Victor, he'll talk about it tomorrow, is on conversion therapy. And this was raised yesterday, forcing people to convert in terms of what they are, what they feel. And this is happening not so far from my country. But some countries like Germany have now, or are now introducing a law against forced conversion therapy. But even this issue was raised by this person who's written all these books for children recently. It's been in the news for the past week, you know, in terms of the person's openness to conversion therapy, whereas I think many of us, including me, are against conversion therapy, because this psychologizes, medicalizes what we are, whereas we're not. We don't want to be psychologized. So this is something that the new report, independent expert, has covered a lot in the most recent report. So have a look at that. It just came out a couple of months ago. It's on the web. Next one. Sociocultural and economic political inclusion. When I started to help, I put sociocultural exclusion. Well, I didn't forget about economic political, but I used sociocultural because I wanted to tackle cultures, particularly religions and societal leaders, in terms of how we would welcome an openness towards gender diversity. And today, this fifth issue, I think we can write it a little bit more broadly. So we should include economic and political, which means that we look at a whole variety of other stakeholders linked with us, business sector, politicians, and so on. So, and yet, from one angle, particularly in COVID times, we are facing political repression in many countries. Freedom of expression is being impacted upon. They're citing computer crimes law, they're citing cyber law, terror law, emergency law, criminal code. They're clamping down on NGOs that work on LGBTI. So freedom of expression and assembly, association, all being clamped down upon under this ascendancy of the executive branch today, which we witness. And yet we have to mobilize to counter this creeping unnecessary jurisdiction of the executive branch on many fronts. Now, let me just have a look briefly at how we've also tried to evolve the business sector a bit more. And there was progress on this very much in regard to the business sector, particularly before this COVID time, with the decline of jobs and the business sector also in the doldrums and so on. But 2 or 3 years ago, business sector were quite open to taking up LGBTI issues in terms of economic access and commitments as follows. Next one. Okay, and these issues are dealt with by Victor's report to some extent last year as well. It's interesting that the UN has also evolved standards of conduct for business. And this came out a couple of years ago, particularly on sexual orientation and gender identity, benefiting, of course, LGBTI. And quite a few members of the business community were taking this up in terms of commitment as a pledge to integrate these standards in their work. But of course, today with COVID, it's going to be much more difficult because everyone is just so concerned about economic survival, including the small scale businesses and the larger scale, but the small scale businesses are really having a tough time. Likewise, the vulnerable people, including LGBTI, who are part of this economic phenomenon. But in a good sense, let's not forget the 5 standards that the UN tried to nurture among the business sector, which still should be borne in mind even in COVID times, as follows. Next slide. Number 1, respect human rights. An invitation from these UN guidelines on business and LGBTI would call for our relationship with business sector. We're asking them to develop policies, exercise due diligence, respect human rights, provide remedies, and establish mechanisms and communicate well on these human rights standards without discrimination. Standard 2, we call for elimination of discrimination, and this means that businesses, large and small, are invited to engage with this issue and to take action against discrimination in the workplace, starting from recruitment to employment to working conditions to benefits to privacy to treatment against harassment and so on. And we'll see some indicators of practices on this front in a moment. Standard 3. We invite provision of support, particularly to recognize that LGBTI individuals can be employers, employees, managers, and so on. And yet they are faced with many obstacles in terms of exclusion versus inclusion. And we want to nurture businesses that provide a positive, affirmative environment within the organization so that everyone can work without stigma. And we'll see some indicators of how to do this in a moment. Next one. Standard 4 is to invite prevention of other human rights violations. And the call is very much to have businesses not discriminate against LGBTI, but to ensure also that those in the supply chain, the global and local supply chain, abide. So we're thinking also about distributors, suppliers, and also customers, consumers, to be part of the positive chain, the positive network, rather than to be part of the negative chain of violence and discrimination stigma. And this means sort of partnership between different levels, different stages of the business community. Next one. And finally, the hope in regard to the business community is that they will use their leverage in the public sphere, meaning that they are invited to use their weight to stop human rights abuses in the countries where they operate. which means that they should work well with local communities to identify possibilities, and importantly, of course, to work well with LGBTI people, including on advocacy, collective action, and various forms of support. So these are the 5 standards enunciated, which were being taken up quite positively a couple of years back, but now, of course, being very much tested with COVID imposing pressures on everyone, including the business sector, particularly small-scale industries that are now going bankrupt, sadly. Next one. Now, the positive developments included, over the past few years, the evolution of a corporate equality index to invite companies to take up the cudgel of applying those standards, and then monitors can come along and have a look at the situation, and with various indicators, they can be measured and they can be incentivized. They might get an award, perhaps, to recognize the good things that they've done. And so this index, which is on the web, which has been operational for the past few years, actually looks at these 4 elements: company policy in terms of leadership and management, inclusive benefits, particularly non-violence and non-discrimination, the provision, the nurturing of conducive environment, which means training within the company, data collection, complaints channels and supports, and responsible citizenship, meaning the link with the supply chain and the consumers outside. So these are the constituents of various indicators which are used to accumulate the points, so to speak, under this index, where you'd be recognized for good work in accordance with a tally of I don't know, several hundred marks, so to speak, and you might get an award in the end in terms of an incentive. So let's see what they've done next. So let's have a look. The Gender Equality Index. Now, I'm selling this. I'm not really selling it. I'm just noting it. But I want to see a parallel index for asylum. So maybe, Sojika, the next step that you could help us with is an asylum index with various indicators, which interlinks also with LGBTI, because we do need some monitoring, ways of measuring, qualitative and quantitative, and humans, business sectors, etc. Everybody wants some incentives, while at times we also need some sanctions. But very often, you know, let's look at the incentives first. And this is one of the ways of incentivizing conduct and behavior, which is responsive to nonviolence and non-discrimination. So this Human Rights Campaign evolved this index, and let's see the sorts of points that they give in terms of operationalization for a company. What does the company have to prove? Well, number one, you know, workforce protection, 30 points possible. The company has to prove that it has a policy that includes respect for sexual orientation for all operations. And if you can prove that as a company, you get 15 marks. Likewise, another 15 if you can prove that you've included gender identity or expression. Next one. Inclusive benefits, 30 points, which looks at various possibilities in terms of how the company responds to the employees, and 30 points and 10 points. This means also being respectful, being kind to the spouses in terms of benefits. It might be medical insurance, it might be longer term unemployment benefits, which should respond to a family situation of LGBTI. Next one. As I said, yes, soft benefits, medical and health coverage. And particularly, of course, we should respond to specifics such as transgender people who have particular needs, and likewise intersex people who have particular medical needs as well. And so if the company bears those elements in mind, they get points, 10 by 10. Next one. A supportive culture and corporate social responsibility. The company must prove that it has training programs, and if it does prove that it has at least 3 internal training programs, it gets 10 marks. And likewise, this should ensure respect for diversity and commitment to competency, including possibly these elements which can be part of the assessment process as follows. Next one. You have to prove as a company that when you're hiring someone new, the policy is clear in terms of respect for gender identity, sexual orientation. Supervisors at companies must undergo training on gender identity and sexual orientation. And today we could just add on the other constituents that we were talking about earlier as discrete topics and provide scenarios illustrating the policy for each. Next one. Integration of gender identity and sexual orientation in professional development and skills for leadership. So the leaders, the CEOs must also commit, and there must be some form of training for them too. As you know, CEOs don't have time, not much time. So, I mean, you just have to cater to some extent to that specific. But at other levels, particularly those auditing the situation, perhaps the training can be longer in terms of the type of courses. Whereas with your people at the top, you want policy commitment, and the time available is very succinct, so to speak. And we'll have to plan well in terms of outreach to different levels of the company. And there should also be gender transition guidelines and supportive restroom. As I was saying earlier, maybe gender neutral facilities, dress code, and documentation. Next one. Anonymous employee engagement or surveys that are conducted as monitoring to allow option to identify as whom we are, and data collection. But data collection on very necessary issues, and of course with due respect to privacy, and with optional questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'll come to privacy issues in a moment. So that's the situation, particularly as the lead up to COVID. But now, of course, the whole industry, big, small, medium, they're all impacted upon, including LGBTI people and the general community. So we are faced very much with unemployment, we're faced with destitution, and we're faced with the challenge of economic revitalization as well as regeneration with social protection. So in some countries, in this country, about 10 million people, including, I'm sure, LGBTI, registered for government support of about $200 a month for 3 months. So the government's giving about $200, the local equivalent, for about 3 months to nearly 10 million people. And the question is, what next after the 3 months? Let's plan together. So move on. Right. Next issue. Education with empathy. A lot of the problems start when we're young in terms of discrimination, particularly bullying. So anti-bullying campaigns are very important. And UNESCO has done some good work on this in terms of sexuality education. And we're thinking really in terms of broad-based education. It may be sort of socialization process at home, within the community, and sensitization from a young age, particularly against hate speech and intolerance. On this front, I remember asking a school teacher in Argentina how she was teaching gender diversity. And I got some really good tips, like you can use fairy tales, particularly with young kids, and get away from stereotypes, overturn the stereotypes like this. You can have a fairy tale where instead of a king falling in love with a queen, you can have 2 kings that fall in love, or 2 queens that fall in love. What's the problem with that? Very natural. And we have queens with capital letters or no capital letters that might fall in love. So what? It's a private matter. So that was a nice lesson for me in terms of someone who had engineered a certain example in a wonderful sense. And she also said that the way she taught gender diversity was also to bring on board the parents. So it wasn't just to the young kid, but she had a talk with the parents saying, well, look, it's good to know one's gender identity. It's good to know one's sexual orientation, because it's also a question of self-protection. I mean, you can protect yourself more if you know whom you are. And in terms of medical access and so on, you will know more what you would wish to access if you know your sexual orientation and gender identity, rather than shutting everything and not talking about any of these issues, which are very human issues. So this was a lot of wisdom from a teacher who was doing great work at the local level. And you will find this everywhere. So please be encouraged that there are great examples all over the place, which we can learn from. And we must maximize these wonderful little lessons, which have enormous implications for everyone. Next one. Gender neutral facilitation of facilities. One issue that I think has come on the table much more over the past 2 years is the question of gender markers and how we are almost compelled to put something on paper or on the computer in terms of ticking when the boxes aren't there, and there are only 2 boxes, male or female. And it's not just on gender. I mean, I do not like boxes which want to know my religion, you know. So also these markers have implications in terms of intersectionality, in terms of whom we are and what we believe in as humans. And so trying to get away from these gender markers and have standards for this. And I'll talk about Jakarta +10 in a moment, because there was a lot on how to deal with gender markers through the right to privacy as well as recognition of gender identity. And that will come in a moment. But let me just note that one university I visited where we had a really great seminar on gender identity and sexual orientation in Argentina, they showed me the toilet. You know, they converted the toilet into gender neutral toilets. And now I think some UN agencies are starting to convert. You don't need to split the toilets. All you need to do is maybe just put in a door with a cabin where anybody can enter, and you just train people accordingly. Likewise, be very sensitive to what happens in prisons here. In some countries, you know, there's a debate on whether you need a 3rd toilet. But, you know, let's be fair. In many countries, people don't even have a toilet. They defecate outside. So let's not forget the right to sanitation for everyone and use our resources well. So instead of building a 3rd toilet, maybe the solution is let's just have a toilet where you don't have to discriminate in terms of genders, but we train people to be respectful. Thank you. Next one. 8.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Just to tell you that we got just 10 minutes more, so...
Okay, fine. I'll just wrap up. Fine. All right. So, well, this is a message from Jakarta Principles, and I won't go into this. You can just check on this, but it's one that deals a lot with gender markers. So let's just skip the next 2 or 3 slides. Okay, skip next one. All right. So it's a very nice principle here in terms of what is sought in terms of gender markers. So here we want to advocate that if we are to have gender markers, which actually impinge upon our privacy, they should be relevant, reasonable, and necessary as required by law for a legitimate purpose. The government has to prove that rather than just any old argument. So it has to be a high threshold if you're going to have a gender marker. And this is according to these Jakarta Principles, which are a summary of international law, evolved through the years and as sanctioned, as concretized, particularly by international interlocutors on these issues. So let's pass on that and let's move towards the end. Next one. I'll pass on that. Civil union marriage, a big debate. International law is not clear on this, but I'm open to either civil union or marriage. And to recognize also that in many regions of the world, this is still not possible. And even if you have a law on civil union or marriage, you still have to deal with issues of adoptions and tax relief and so on. So I'd hope that gradually, learning from various countries that have these laws, we can build a comprehensive approach on this, which caters to 2 people who love each other, who want to take care of each other, who will enjoy the benefits of themselves, and a broad notion of the family, including the children, including inheritance, including tax relief, and so on. And in my country, there's a civil union law being debated here at the moment, but there's an issue about adoption, which is not clear, and there's no tax relief either under the civil union. But of course, Taiwan now has a marriage law, as I said, and yet we have to debate over there on gender identity, as I said. So there is a diversity of issues that we should not generalize about. So let's come to the last slide. So within this spectrum, this panorama of issues, let's also look at these times as opportunities also. And let's not be despondent. We still have strength. Let's work well through good examples and through good advocacy and through good alliance building. We want good laws and reform bad laws. You know what they are. We want good policies. We want good programs. We want good practices, cases, such as the most recent United States case, where the Supreme Court came out in favor of protecting LGBTI people from discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. And that's contrary to the less open policy of the authorities in the United States at this point in time. So you have the judiciary as a check and balance there. We would want good personnel, we want education, capacity building. All these are strategies that we should hold dear to and try to maximize. Next slide. Accountability and remedies, good resourcing, money and more, data monitoring, leadership, checks and balances, particularly in these COVID times, and great participation with great respect to stakeholders, particularly LGBTI, and networking mobilization. So this is really a time where networking, alliance building is very important as a check and balance against this encroachment, increasing encroachment of executive power in COVID times. Next one. Finish. Message is, let's recover better together. And finally, next one. Thank you very much, because we are all part of a great partnership. We will give hope because we are working for a world respectful of gender diversity, and let's open the windows of opportunities, even in these critical times of COVID-19, and work towards a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vitit, for this really amazing presentation, and I'm sure that everyone is applauding all participants. So I do this for them.